Whatto, it's Dr. Jason Fox here, Archwizard of Ambiguity. Join me as we foray deeper into complexity, paradox and doubt so as to reap the dark and dubious fruits of wisdom for our combined edification and delight. In this episode, I have a chat with Oscar Trimboli. Oscar is the guy behind Deep Listening, Impact Beyond Words. He's an author, a speaker, a facilitator. He's worked through corporate at very large levels with huge impact. He's a wonderful, wise, humble person with deep insight and expertise. And this episode is a joy to unpack some of the things. So join me. Whatto, yes. So, I'm playing with this other intro thing because in some of the research for this podcast, I had to listen to Oscar's podcast, and he starts off with something like award-winning Apple podcast, and I noticed that Oscar, Amantha, my friend with the podcast How I Work, there seems to be this thing, Jocelyn Glye, Hurry Slowly, they have this tendency of starting with a description of what the podcast is about, and as I kind of contemplate moving beyond this amateur, meandering, unedited form into something that's professional, meandering, unedited form, I'm considering what things to learn from others in the field. Maybe some sort of thing would be good. I don't know. Part of being an Archwizard of Ambiguity is that it's hard to know. There's nebulosity and so forth. So I'm not really sure. Anyway, if you listened to the last episode, you heard me lament at my my kind of the interviewing, my lack of interviewing prowess when it came to the last interview. Partly because I tripped myself up in the terms of the technology. Well, this time, Oscar and I met in person. Oscar is based in Sydney, but he happened to be in Melbourne. And on a kind of a grey, wet day, made the trip over to the old chocolate factory wherein I live, along with the Danger Lamb and our cat Pie. And he came up and we had a lovely chat in person. I made a peppermint tea. That's kind of, when someone arrives, I kind of go to host mode and I'm trying to be cool and chill, and he's just breathing beautifully and creating this kind of sense of ease around me. And I'm kind of like, I was going to take the tea bag out of the cup too early because he likes his peppermint tea strong, as do I. I don't even know why I was trying to take it out early. But we got to this place of settling in, and I learned from the previous thing I did, where you just put the record button on straight away, and because a lot of the gold happens before and after, and so I did that, and so you'll hear this podcast kind of launch straight into the conversation that we were having, and it's wonderful. So for those that. As ever, I'll include show notes and all of those things. I kind of didn't even do a proper intro and stuff. But if you want to check out Oscar Trimboli, it's OSCAR. Oscar Trimboli. I'll put it in the show notes. Oscar has been a senior executive at Microsoft and has worked in very complex environments. And a few years ago, when we were running this event called, I've known of Oscar's work for some time. He's an author and blah, blah, well respected, lovely. He's one of those likewise introverted folks that seek out the kind of quieter havens and have this kind of yearning for nuance and depth, which I deeply admire. A few years ago, we were running this event called Percolate, a precursor to Progress. It was this ridiculously it was a significant event, but it was at a time that a lot of stuff was going on in my world. I should do an actual unpacking of that sometime. Anyway, I won't go into the whole story there, but we hired Oscar deliberately as a pattern disrupt. Normally events start with some kind of J-Lo Let's Get Loud is playing and there's someone runs on stage and stuff like that. Not at an event that I would run. So we started with Oscar as the opening keynote, and he did such a good job of creating almost a sense of arrival from the buzz of things. It's and a sense of presencing and a sense of stillness and openness and awareness and curiosity and folks leaning in. There's a kind of a magic to his work that in this interview I attempt to tease out. We seem to we start a little bit talking about or kind of comparing notes with our keynote experiences, and then we dive into the stance and approach around a strategical leadership offsite. And I get a chance to ask some of the behind-the-scenes questions of how Oscar approaches things. It's one of those things where, you know, when you're in the presence of a good storyteller, you can hear a pin drop. I found myself mesmerized or captivated. Just that there's this kind of there is what Megumi Miki would call a quietly powerful presence about Oscar. And so compared to the last interview, and I shouldn't compare myself, everything is unique. Everything is everything. It is what it is. But I also noticed that because it wasn't a setup where I had my mic levels, where I'm missing some, it's done. It's over, Jason. Just be. Anyway, what I found was there was a lot of space and a lot of space for emergence. It was one of those things where I was conscious that he had to leave by a particular time for a flight, so you'll hear a bit of a muddled rush towards the very end. But Oscar handled it all with equanimity and aplomb and a kind of contextual grace that I find deeply inspiring. So I think you're going to particularly enjoy this one, and I think it's fun to share this learning journey with you and to be able to think in draft and watch the evolution of character. It's painful in some regards because there is part of me that wants to create something perfect, impactful thing, but the conscious choice to not edit any of this means that you'll get a little bit more a higher resolution, more fidelity, more truth in this, which I just hope might encourage more people to kind of lose a little bit of the polish potentially and just embrace. I don't know what I'm saying. I'm getting carried away here. Anyway, before I get into it, just another little reminder, a couple of things. I'm about to do this kind of, well, I shouldn't talk it up, but I'm going to be shifting my stance and approach to things. So there's going to be a few changes, and it might result in some hiccups. Who knows? I know I'm being very mysterious and coy, so don't build expectations. Keep it low. Okay, so nothing much is happening. But one of the things I'd really deeply appreciate is if you happen to know, if you happen to listen to this and know someone who might benefit from this, spread the word. If you happen to really dig this, a written review is always appreciated, particularly 5-star reviews with nice comments. That's nice, but anything you want, really. It's all good. I do like the 5-star ones. That's lovely. And it helps people find the podcast. And so if you feel, if you share the quest that I have, a quest to create a world that's more curious and kind, curious, nuanced and kind, and you say this is like helpful or something along those lines, a review is deeply appreciated. Just jump onto iTunes and whack it in. Thank you, of course, to everyone who's left a review of all stars and all descriptions. I really, really appreciate it. The other thing that is wonderfully supportive is signing up to my newsletter, drjasonfox.com/ahoy. Traditionally, I've written about 5 per year, but my intention is to shift my stance here and to treat it a bit more like a personal letter, a little bit more like an update. There's these lovely channels of kind of non-optimized, non-gamified, non-public forums and spaces, and the podcast and the newsletter is one of them that create these little havens of intimacy where you don't necessarily have to preen yourself for the stranger, the masses. It's kind of like there's a bit more intimacy, warmth and depth, and this podcast and that channel are two of the main ways in which I am able to share. So that would be lovely. When I was at this event, Spaces, it was a wonderful event, Space Series. I was very, very impressed. I mentioned it a couple of episodes ago, How to Enchant a Ritual event. I was having a chat with Amantha, who does the How I Work podcast, and she was just saying that the written reviews are like some of the warmest, nicest, fuzziest feelings. So Anyway, appreciate all those that do that. Enough of this stuff. Let's get into the podcast itself with Oscar Trimboli. I think that if you've ever thought about speaking to an audience, if you've ever thought about hosting a meeting with meaning and depth, if you've ever wanted to kind of be a little bit more fluid and nimble with agendas to be able to serve the needs that emerge within a room instead of becoming a slave to the program, I think you're going to get a lot out of this. There are some profound I guess, wisdom bombs that kind of erupted in this, or at least erupted in my mind. A chief thing of which happened towards the, I think that somewhere towards the end, there's this notion, this reframe around how I relate to listening. And I only did the podcast a few hours ago, so it's kind of fun to share this intro with you while it's still very, very fresh. It's one of those things that I think will forever change the way that I approach listening. When I find myself, oh, here's an opportunity for deep listening. Yeah, it's profound. So enjoy this. Show notes at drjasonfox.com/podcast. And I heartily recommend you subscribe to Deep Listening, Impact Beyond Words, a podcast by Oscar Trimboli. Without further ado, let's get into it.
Is always in the stuff before.
I was hearing Nassim Taleb, the author of Anti-Fragile, talk about how he deliberately speaks a bit quieter when he's doing keynotes on stage because it encourages people to lean in and listen more.
Something people notice when I speak about my use of pause, and it's very deliberate to slow the audience down. A couple of people have often take me aside and say, is this a guided meditation? And I go, not by design, but if that's how you experience it, that's great, because I think helping people to slow down, helping people to notice their breathing, and helping people to just work with silence more than sound is something that's really absent today. And I think it's a really good antidote for where the audience I work with love to be.
Yeah. I had a briefing for a conference coming up recently, and they were very reassuring to me that don't worry, it's going to be high energy all the way through. We have DJs. We're going to come up with some sort of, the music will be pumping when you walk up on stage. We have people in the crowd and I thought of you, actually. I thought of the wonderful effect and what a blessing you'd probably be to a large proportion of the audience at an event like this. How do you find, because one of the things I noticed, because you're in the room, naturally you're sensing the energy. How do you, if you're introduced on stage but you feel, oh, there's a mismatch in energy here, how do you adjust in that regard?
Yeah, you can get away with a lot when you're the listening person, right?
Yes.
So you can walk on stage and work a pause for anywhere up to 90 seconds.
Really?
Yeah. So you can manage and it's evolved for me. It's not where I started, but what I started to notice is when I was more congruent with me on stage, the pauses were longer, which gave the room time to think. But yeah, if that situation happens, which it has, anywhere up to 90 seconds where the room's going through this process is like, is this all he's going to do? And then you're creating tension immediately, which is what I'm aiming to do. I'm aiming to shine a light on communications is both speaking and listening. And holding silence for up to 90 seconds creates this powerful tension in the room because people move off their phones. It's like, hang on, I want to watch my phone, but I want to watch this possible car smash on stage. Has this guy lost it?
Yeah,
Is he so nervous he can't even speak? And then I say, the irony is not lost on me that I'm speaking to you about listening. And it kind of bursts the balloon and the tension goes straight back out again.
So you're quite still, I imagine, when that's happening as well. You're not fidgeting or it's... See, that's a really powerful opening line. And I feel like I've got some sort of humor ramping in my keynote too. But my worry is sometimes my opening has become so strong and there's so much subtle heavy lifting that happens around that opening that it's become a little bit of a crutch for me. Have you ever had to open up in a different way or a different style? Because I'm asking this as someone who, is likewise a practitioner, where there's a kind of a paradox of you develop and refine a really good thing, and then it becomes increasingly hard to let go of that thing that you've created. How do you process that?
Yeah, there's a predictability in the punch line, and I think in keynotes there's a lot of similarities with comedians.
Yeah.
Comedians talk about they kill, and some people walk off stage saying that as well when they speak. But yeah, I had the opposite happen where in Australia recently we've had 3 significant royal commissions, one into the financial services industry, currently one into the aged care industry, and also one into institutions and sexual violence against children. And I recently, not that long ago, it's probably a year ago now, worked in a financial services organisation where the systemic lack of listening was the reason there was a regulatory investigation into them. And that was not the time for the tension to be created. That was the time at which I stepped on stage and said, "You're probably wondering what a guy who's an expert on listening does. And I struggle with listening as much as you do. The difference between me and you is I'm conscious of it. And these are the things I struggle with. And I think to help them access the possibility that we're just all humans trying."
Yeah.
That was what, that moment wasn't the moment for tension. They'd been beaten up. Some people... I can feel it in my voice right now, actually, the emotion that was present in the room. Some people realise that it's a systemic issue in financial services in that kind of context, and nobody individually can take accountability for it, yet some people take very personal accountability. Some people lost their livelihood, their houses, and some people even lost their lives because they made the final choice. So I think in listening to the room, people say to me, like, just how do you notice energy? Because I talk about listening for the energy.
Yeah.
And you probably know this feel where you can walk in the room and despite the fact that they might have a DJ, as you mentioned earlier on, what I'm listening for is that it's congruent with where everyone's at rather than what the organisation's trying to project on the event.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's something beautiful about that because it's deeply empathetic, and it's also, I imagine, as you hallucinate what may be on people's minds as well, they may be thinking, who is this expert prick coming in to tell us what to do? But instead to actually say, hey, I struggle too. And it's kind of like an inversion or a pattern disrupt there, which was subtly quite profound in terms of giving them not what they expected, but what they potentially needed in that moment. When it comes to openings, I tend to use humor as a way to ping the audience, almost like a sonar ping to see where the pockets of engagement are. But I wonder, like, if we were to delve into the magic of it a little bit, into the nuances, what are some of the subtle cues that you look for? And this may be in a speaking sense, but also I'm curious to dive into how you might approach a more facilitation space, where it's a smaller group, higher intimacy, but your attunement to the nuances would probably be much, much higher. So, I mean, sorry, there's a complex question. What are some of the things that you look for? And then maybe we can start to unpack how you might approach a delicate facilitation task.
So for those of you who don't speak often, you're quite often in these blaring lights that you literally can't see the audience. And for me, initially, when that first happened to me, it was like, oh my goodness, you're taking away one of my listening devices, my eyes. And then I thought, this is actually a blessing because I get to sense more. I get to feel more. I get to use my intuition more. And not to use the castle too much, but it's the vibe.
Yeah, totally. It's Marvo.
And, you know, when I'm in the room before speaking, I'm really deliberately looking around and going, what's happening over there? What's the interaction there? Where are the groups clustering? Are they coming in? What's the energy as they're coming in? Is the energy a function of the level of sound they're making, the conversation? Or are there more murmurs? Or are there more whisperings? And so when I'm on stage and the big lights are on, I'm really probably noticing more silence than other things. So you mentioned you'd notice where the laughter might come back from the sonar ping. I'm probably the opposite. I'm going, where's the silence? Where is that energy not coming back? And I'm not overtly trying to work that part of the room. I'm just curious about, I wonder what's on their mind in that moment. Because I think those people may be processing it differently. They may be thinking about it differently. So if the ping is longer, to take the metaphor a little bit further, I'm okay with that, because in traveling across distant water, you get into the deeper stuff.
Oh, that's nice. That's good.
You know,
That's
as an ocean swimmer, so for my sins, one of the things I do with joy is I fundraise for a cancer charity. So we run in summer, in winter, and we swim in summer, and it's ocean swimming. And when the water is dark and you can't see the bottom, I'm okay with that. Yeah, when it's a bright sunny day and the water's still and I can see all the way down to the bottom, I completely freak out because I can see everything. Whereas when it's dark, I can make up stories about what's there or what's not there. And so true it might be about when you're in an audience listening to the speaker, because for you as the audience, you're in the dark too, usually, if you're speaking on a bigger stage. And I think it's a really nice place to kind of step away from the day. So back to your ping, Jason. I'm okay if it takes a long time for the ping to come back. It might not come back till they come to me at the end of the performance, for want of a better word, and they come up to you afterwards and go, Oscar, you know when you said we'd listen in black and white, but what the world needs to do is listen in colour? I was completely lost for the rest of the presentation, because it took me to places where I do listen in black and white. And what I realised was the missed opportunity for me to listen in colour. Now, for me, that's a throwaway line almost. Now, don't get me wrong, there's enormous thought that's gone into that. But it took somebody completely away. So if they didn't laugh at the next thing I said that had some semblance of humour to it, that's okay if the ping doesn't come back, but the ping comes back. And often the ping never comes back till somebody 3 years later sends you an email and says,
Yeah.
and you're nodding because it's obviously happened to you, right? And you go, wow, people are hearing what you're saying minutes later, hours later, years later, and sometimes decades later. And you need to be comfortable with the fact that we don't need the instant.
Yeah.
If it's sustained change that you're trying to create, which is my journey is a quest to create 100 million deep listeners. I know that it's not the number of followers I have on a social media that's going to get me there. It's over time. It's deliberate. It's consistency. So that's from the stage. How do I sense? And I'm probably not as tuned as you probably thought I was. Meaning, if I don't get the ping back, I'm completely okay with that. And then we can move on to facilitation. But the look on your face has got me thinking about what you're pondering.
Oh, no. I mean, I was like, no, just that last line, the chin, that you're okay with that. It's kind of, there's an interesting kind of calibration, but the keynote itself is a bit of a performance. It is in part theatre. It's a contribution to the pantomime that is an event of which is a lovely opportunity to smuggle or Trojan horse some deep wisdom into the mix. Let's segue to this facilitation bit, because this is interesting. I imagine in my mind, and I'm asking this because I'm personally curious as well, and I imagine many of the listeners who, so speaking is one thing, but hosting a really important meeting or gathering a diversity of minds together to unpack, to kind of arrive at some sort of shared decision or awareness or something, it's a delicate and complex process, and I'm curious as to how you might approach this. And I say this, and what fuels my curiosity is sometimes these strategic offsites, leadership offsites or something, that there's a certain charge about them. I know you have a rich experience in corporate life, so you get the complexity of the different stakeholders. And then everyone comes in with their different politics or their different senses of what they want to get out of it. And when I'm curious as how you approach this. So let's say you get the call and say, Oscar, we're thinking about, we feel like our strategy is not serving us, even though we invested a lot of effort into this. 2 years in, we just don't feel like it's serving us right now. And we've got this idea to bring everyone together. There's this lovely offsite. It'll be a nice space where we can work together undistracted. Everyone's busy, of course, and everyone's feeling the crunch, but can you come in and help us out and facilitate? And I'm giving you complete openness there, because I imagine there's a little bit of heft in the lead up to it. But how would you approach this?
So how I approach it now and how I approach it when I started are completely different.
Yep.
So I think it will be useful to understand that journey. And how I approached it initially was I needed to listen to every stakeholder prior to getting together. There was a set of structured interview questions that I would ask them, and there was also some room for exploration, something that might emerge from the conversation, and bring that knowing into the room. And why did I do that? So that I could notice where people weren't having the honest conversation. Yet in that knowing and in that moment where I speak to all these people individually, you and I probably dance with the same question regularly. What's the opposite? This is our approach. What would be a different approach? And my question I pose to myself is, what's the room losing by not hearing all the conversations I've had? So the evolution of that was I completely stopped doing the pre-interviews. And a lot of my clients who maybe use me for a couple of years sequentially would go, hey, well, I really enjoyed the pre-interview. You know, that was my chance to go into the corporate confessional and behind the veil of secrecy, tell you my deepest sins. And that's great. That was a purpose for them. But the reality was we need the room to listen to each other. So what evolved from that is, how do we get that same effect with everybody hearing everybody else? And now we talk to rituals. So again, an evolution for me was noticing that corporates do a very poor job of the ritual of the funeral. So you play in this space where you have the strategy and we're all about the new and we're all about the future. I can't trust you if you don't acknowledge my past. And the corporate funeral of burying the strategy is I start off by playing a really simple game, asking the room, the strategy that's got us here, we need to acknowledge. There are things we can take forward from that, and the things we need to bury and leave in the past. And we need to acknowledge that the past has got us here, because typically when we get into these strategy sessions, they're so future focused that they miss the point of why we got here, or how we got here, or the speed at which we got here. So having this ceremonial funeral for the past is a really important ritual that I've added in now, that brings the room to a common understanding, because in these rooms, you've got range of tenures. You might have people who've been there for decades. You might have people who've been there for minutes. But the people who've been there for minutes don't know the past. And yet the people who've been there for decades are going to be catapulted into a future where you're literally treading on their coffin. All my efforts and what I've contributed to this organisation is not acknowledged today. Now, for all of us who've attended funerals, we know the funerals are for the living. They're not for the dead. And we acknowledge the amazing contribution that people have passed have made. But in that moment, what I noticed is the room listened to itself in a completely different way. And it listened to the past in a completely different way. So one of the areas I'm playing with right now is what's the cost of not listening to the past and what's the cost of not listening to the future. And this is one of the techniques we use to bring the room to its current present state, so they're available to listen to each other while acknowledging the past has got us here. And in that moment, what it's done is create the same effect of me listening in the corporate confessional to each of their stories, because they each get to tell their story. Now, this is a relatively intimate setting, probably 10 to 15 people, roughly the size of a significant leadership team or an extended leadership team. And in that moment, you bring everyone into a place and space that is, now that we've acknowledged the past, now we can have a discussion about the future. But that's not a 5-minute exercise, Jason. That's taking anywhere up to the morning session. So from the time we get into the room to the time we get to morning tea, we're acknowledging the past.
Wow, it's I imagine that's quite. I imagine it would be quite liberating for someone who has come in. Transformation. One of the things I've realized about transformation, and most who know it will understand this too, is it's actually the combination of creativity and destruction. And what many corporates do is we'll focus on what are we going to create, what new things, and strategic offsites then translate into a whole heap of new work without actually resolving the legacy that we have. And that seems like quite a deep and beautiful way to honor the work that has gotten us to where we are. And I do like you use the word ritual here, and I'm curious as to how you might enchant this. And I use this language. I'm speaking very much from a meta-rational perspective. I'm not trying to imbue this with magical thinking, but I think strategic or leadership offsites. I think about some, pending the budget of the company, it can range anywhere from some sort of majestic golf course with all of its opulence to some sort of tired meeting room with low ceilings and fluorescent lighting. So assuming you've got somewhere in between those two extremes, this people are gathered into that room. I imagine some people have things on their mind that they really want to get off their chest, and then suddenly, I can imagine for some people are thinking, why are we doing this? We've got so many things that we need to talk about and stuff. How do you navigate folks through that? Or how do you kind of bring some of the reverence to this? And sorry, I know I'm teasing out quite nuanced and contextual things that you would probably imbue in the moment, but I'm just...
we can zoom into a moment. And funnily enough, it was in Melbourne. It was a May Day. It was about 2015. And I was working with a leadership team that was 11 or 12 people in this room. And it wasn't an opulent offsite. It wasn't the golf course and all the majesty that you referred to earlier on. It was a very narrow room. It was very claustrophobic. And we were at about the 11:45 mark for a 12 o'clock lunch. And the exercise I asked them to explore is thinking about our organisation. What form does it take right now? If we were to put it in the sense of an object that might be tangible for us, what would it be? Now, this was a room of an organisation that was in technology, so hyper growth, there's triple digit growth and what they all aspired to. And they'd scale back to double digit growth, which was 30 odd %, nowhere near where they wanted to be. And they were projecting low teens going forward. And the CEO had asked me to come and figure out how do we break the current state.
The current state being like this sense of...
We're in decline, even though they're growing at 10x GDP.
Yes.
Yet relative to the system and the mindset they operate within, and their peer group is global software companies, and they were very export orientated. So I get why the tension was there. They were still growing faster than their competitors, but just not fast enough for the aspiration of the leadership team and particularly the founder. And as we went around the room, I'd ask people, and the animal that consistently came out was an eagle, an osprey, a sea eagle, some kind of fast-moving bird of prey. So the bird of prey was very, very consistent. And we'd gone around the room, except for Eileen. Now, Eileen is the card-carrying member of the introvert community. Yeah. If you say hands up for all the introverts in the room, she won't put her hand up. Yet in that moment, I could see and notice a pondering. But simultaneously, I'm getting the laser vision from the CEO going, it's 12 o'clock, can we have lunch?
Yes.
So one of the things I'm always conscious to do is... the easiest thing to do is go to the agenda and stick to the timings that is some artificial construct we created in the past, and yet in the moment, if we're really, truly, deeply listening, something emerges. And I'll ask you to describe what enchantment is shortly, but I was curious about that word. So what emerged in that moment was I could move to lunch. I could serve the agenda, or I could trust my intuition and go, the room hasn't been heard, and she has a contribution to make. Now, the worst thing to do at this point is to say to an introvert, I'm curious why you haven't spoken so far.
To thrust the microphone in front of them.
Well, or worse still, it feels like... somebody's drawn a huge sword and thrust it in their general direction. Now, the skill is to have the confidence in your own background as a facilitator to hold that moment. And all I did, and the audience won't be able to see this, Jason, but I literally just put my palm out forward to her. And I looked above her. I didn't look her directly in the eye. And it was in the sense of an invitation. Now, what I noticed was she's processing something very important. My intuition was saying, everything in your head is telling you to move on, and everything in your gut is staying the moment. Now, if you remember back to keynote on stage, I'm happy with up to 90 seconds of silence. But for people who are not comfortable with silence, it feels like an eternity. It actually feels like a waste of time. And I was keeping my gaze directly above Eileen, and I didn't want to lose it because her background was from an Asian culture, so direct eye contact isn't the most sensitive, culturally aware thing to do. But particularly as Aussies, we do it a lot. So I was conscious to create a space of safety for her, because that moment where what she was about to say next completely changed the organisation's trajectory.
Wow.
I paused at about the 30-second mark and turned to my host, and he was still giving me, imagine those superheroes with the laser lights straight into my eyes, going, can we get to lunch?
Yep.
He literally was tapping at his watch. And I just smiled, turned back, and she breathed out and said, I thought it was obvious, but I'm the only one in the room who thinks differently. She paused. She didn't continue. And again, I just extended my arm just a little bit further towards her, just to make the invitation a little bit further. She said, I thought we're a snake. Now, what's going through your head right now? What are the characteristics of a snake that you're associating, Jason?
Right. So bird of prey compared to a snake is very good at camouflage, very good at moving in the undercurrents, sensing things, highly sensitive, the tongue sense of vibrations, the attunement to the forces that are going on, comfort operating beneath the radar, and there's a kind of almost like a poise to strike, or that kind of, when the moment is right type of vibe to a snake. It's as well as all the kind of, I guess, there's the, snake's nasty, evil, all that stuff. There's a lot of attributes that a snake can embody.
Yeah. So I simply said, tell me more. And you could see the bristling from the other people around the room. We're eagles, we're birds of prey, we're fast moving, and you're comparing us to this slithering thing on the ground. What's that all about? You could literally see it on their faces. And she said, we've forgotten to do what snakes are really good at. What we did for our customers was always shed our skin as the seasons changed, and we adapted to what our customers needed. And I sense we've forgotten how to adapt and how to sense, as you mentioned earlier on. And the tension in the room completely left. Everybody breathed out. And she felt comfortable in telling this whole story that ended up in them adopting a snake as a beanie toy, as a snake as product development code name, so various kinds of snakes. Snakes became a logo. Snakes became part of the story of their sales presentation. And in that moment, where you could easily have stayed in the agenda.
Gone to lunch.
Gone to lunch.
Flock of birds.
And had a conversation that really is incredibly superficial. In that moment where I stayed with her, in what probably was perceived by her as a lifetime, and yet so transformational. And a lot of my work is listening to what's unsaid. And in the workshop itself, we're going to come back here in a sec, but in the workshop for me, I always have fun with the breaks. So when people have breaks, I always open up by coming back in and go, wow, hey, thanks for coming back on time. I really appreciate that. But as I do, I was listening to all the conversations out there, and the kind of conversations we're having in here are very different to the kinds of conversations we're having out there. Are there any conversations from the break we should be bringing into this conversation? Now, how deeply am I listening to those conversations? Sometimes quite a bit. Mostly it's just a reflection to the room to say, you listen differently to each other out there, and yet we come in here, and you talked about pantomime and theatre earlier on. There is a theatric to the way people believe they should behave in these workshops. And the role of the facilitator is to create and architect enchantment in that moment, that they can have the conversation that matters, rather than the conversation they thought they needed to have 3 or 4 weeks ago when they put an agenda together. You've probably done this in country Victoria, you've probably done this in the mountains of the Blue Mountains in Sydney, the beaches of Queensland, wherever it might be. In the breaks, that's where coalitions go back to naturally forming. That's where people start to talk about the things that really matter. they're the unspoken. I always say the undiscussables are always discussed except where they matter. And in those conversations, so the brave groups, when I make the invitation, I heard a kind of different conversation out there. The brave people will speak up and say, yeah, well, we haven't talked about.
Yes, exactly.
And you can see everybody have that moment to go, that's exactly what we need to talk about. And the agenda for me at that moment, and this is the skill of the host or the leader hosting this offsite in that moment, does the leader have certainty in themselves enough to go, the agenda matters now more than ever, and they stick to it? Or do they say the agenda matters not at all, and this is the conversation we need to have? And I think to some extent there's levels of adult development that showcase themselves pretty quickly in the leader, because some leaders want to shut it down and, no, we need to review the employee engagement statistics that we said we would review in the agenda. And yet the conversation they need to have is why the employee engagement is so in the toilet. That's what they were talking about outside. That's a kind of real example from an offsite I did about 9 months ago. So you can have so much enchantment with the listening if you're free enough to go, it's what the group needs to discuss rather than what the agenda sets out. And the group will do that if you notice their energy.
Yeah.
Rather than what they're saying. Like, saying is such a superficial level. What they say and what they mean are two different things. So it's come back to Eileen in the example about the snake. As a result of the snake, they reached back up to 30% growth. But it's what the leader said next. So we're supposed to be at lunch. We're at 12:10 roughly. And what the leader said next, he turned to me and said, thank you, Oscar. You've heard something I've been ignoring. And I've been ignoring our best people. You've taught me a powerful lesson. Now, that showed great humility.
Yeah.
That showed great reverence for what had just been discussed. And what he did with it next mattered more than even the conversation, to be deadly honest. But it's my role to curate the situation in that moment, not by some rational model that I have in my head, not by
moving through a quadrant,
3 intersecting Venns or a quadrant model or whatever that progression ladder might be. Although that's informed us and we kind of acknowledge why that's important. It's in sensing as a human to another human. There's more nerve endings in your gut than there is in your brain. And there's a reason why we need to trust our gut feel a lot more in the workplace, because we do at home. And for me, ultimately, it's just how do you bring those things into the workplace to make it okay? Like, a lot of people go to me, I didn't think this is what it would be like. And rather than me asking, what did you think it would be like? I say the same. I didn't know where it was going either. And I'm always open to that possibility. So kind of structure and discipline creates the framework, and you can pull things out from that. But if you're not present enough in the facilitation to sense these things, and you're looking at your watch and going, what time's the catering coming in?
Or the cut sandwiches, and yeah.
You could miss the snake moment, as I call it.
Well, I mean, that's beautiful and captures the magic of what is possible if you've gathered the mix of minds and held the space and held the tension for the magic to emerge. I relate. What I find, what I'm curious about is there's conversations that typically happen and lead up to offsites where there's a lot of almost kind of reassurance that you've got to do with the client, because they want to say, well, what's the agenda? What's the pre-work? What do we need to do? Normally we have a 98 slide PowerPoint deck that to brief everyone up here. And then we need to know and all the things. And I find one of the things what I end up trying to do is say, look, the agenda is an amusing hypothesis. It might not actually manifest like that. We're going to be fuzzy with the boundaries, and we don't want to become slaves to the agenda. And then I try to use terms like generative ambiguity, which I quite like. But the clients are often like, yes, well, as long as on day 2, we have everyone leave with a clear sense of what they need to do next. We want actionable steps. We want to, how do you go, because part of our work is opening, it's unraveling, it's getting to the deeper questions, but there's still this kind of, if you think about the peak end experience, Daniel Kahneman's work about how people remember a thing, a lot of people still want to land with something at the end. There's this tension of like too many open folders. How do you go with like we talked about the ritual of opening. What does the close of an offsite look like for you? If close is the right word.
Yeah. I often wonder in our speculation that the agenda is a interesting hypothesis. If we're truly serving in that moment, and is that language something that's useful to somebody who's in a fairly structured system? So let me pause and give you a commercial break from my life in corporate, because I think it'll help you with a bit of empathy here, Jason. So I ran a business at Microsoft. It was $1 billion business. It was the largest product line that Microsoft had. It was going through a massive transition. And our metrics were set at the beginning of a financial year. And there was a 90 to 180 day process the year before to socialize and get those agreed metrics in place. So not what the values are, what the metrics should actually be. Should the metrics be about what you sell, or should it be about what the customer actually uses? That was a real conversation we had. Now, my stakeholder community inside the organization was roughly 80 people. My stakeholder community outside was about 24,000 organizations who resold the product. Everybody from a retailer like Harvey Norman to a massive enterprise provider like an IBM, a Hewlett Packard, all these big organization names that are household brands. So in any day, I could be going from a meeting talking about moving from a DVD on a shelf at Harvey Norman to a voucher with a special code on that, and what that meant for a retailer where shelf space was how they measured your worth as a provider, all the way through to a very important, but not necessarily to everybody listening, conversation about the location of the points of presence as it related to our data center for our Perth users and our Canberra users relative to the Singapore data center, and the impact that had on an end user's speed at which they either experience something at seconds or sub-second experience. So you can see you're zooming in and zooming out to big conversations. And as a corporate, I wanted some certainty. I think if you walked in, I would have been curious in parts and equally frustrated to go, oh, it's okay for you, wizard. You can skate across the top of the business community, but this is my reality, because the minute you walk out, I've got to come back into this system that's structured and sequential and logical, and you don't get me. So yeah, sprinkle your wizard dust on me for a couple of hours, but I need certainty. And that was my world. And it's a world I have immense respect for. So not too long ago, I was doing an offsite for a company that's in machine learning, the ultimate sequential, logical system. I always joke the most manual, labor-intensive profession in the world is technology, because people literally still writing code. And it was an offsite, and the outcome was for the team to create its own organizational values. That was the output. And we discussed with the sponsor, the CEO, how would that look? But I did pose a question to him and said, you do know where we start and where we finish is going to be two different places. And you do know that values aren't what we put on the wall. It's what informs our decisions every day. And how precise do you want that to be? Very precise was the answer. I do want posters on the wall.
Okay.
And my question is to him in that moment was, what do you give up by having those posters on the wall, as well as what do you gain? Because I want him to explore both sides of the duality. And in that exploration, he went, that moment where they, you've gone a layer down and they're in a level beyond thinking, they're down in reflection, they're into pondering, they're into noticing, they're into observation. And I made a simple request of him. And I said, when we step into that room, will you trust me? And he said, well, it depends what trust means. I said, it's trust. I could take the agenda anywhere based on where the room wants it to go, not where the agenda is. And he said, well, if that's where the room wants to go, then I trust you will do that. Now, again, that's quite an enlightened leader. Not all of them do that. A lot of them will say, trust within these parameters, trust within those parameters. If we're on this topic, no. If we're on that topic, yes. And sometimes I have to ask permission, where I will turn to somebody and say, when we discussed this before, you said, we're not going to go there. Mm-hmm. I would like to go there. Where do you want to take it? Now, it's hard for them because they're in the room and the room's noticing how they're responding. Rarely have I had, in fact, I can say never, somebody saying, no, don't go there. There's a level of trust as they watch me in action and start to listen to the clues and the breadcrumbs they're not picking up. Because often they'll come to me and go, you notice stuff like Jason Bourne. You walk into a room and you're already noticing where the exits are in the conversation, not necessarily the actual fire exits. You're noticing how much somebody weighs. You're noticing where the gravity is in the conversation and where it isn't. So remember, at this offsite, we want to get to values. And what we got to by the afternoon tea break was a knowing in the room that we were not going to have values by the time we walked out the door. But what was more brilliant, and this is what the group said to each other, is, so they're an organisation that uses stand-up and scrum and embracing all this modern agility in the workplace. But what I use as part of my process is I always give 10% of the agenda to the room to listen to itself, where I simply say, before we go to the break, what was useful in this process and what can we improve on for the next 90 minutes? And a guy with a Ukrainian background in the room, so imagine how thick his accent would be in English, said, our stand-ups suck. They're a waste of time. Now, we could have quickly moved on, but that became the conversation about how are values showing up in our stand-up? Because they did have a hypothesis beforehand about what values should be, but they weren't using it in the stand-up. Now they've skipped the break. They literally dialogued through the whole thing. And then we took a break. And I took the leader aside while everybody was having a break. And I said, what did you notice there? And he says, I've got to trust myself to listen to what they want to say, not what I want to hear. And our stand-ups are going to transform because ownership of the stand-up just moved from me to them. Not because I created it, because you did, Oscar. And I said, so what's your noticing and learning for you? He says, I'm holding control way too tight. to help everybody be their best. By the end of the day, we didn't get to values. But as we debriefed, so this is a long-winded way to go, how do you close? Mm-hmm. In the debrief, I simply ask people to make a reflection. Sometimes I can orchestrate this depending on the group I'm working with. So an orchestration would be, I would hand everybody an envelope before the session starts. And I would say at the beginning of the session, I want you to notice one thing this person does great today, because at the end of the session, we're going to acknowledge that person. Mm-hmm. But in this session, what I wanted everybody to acknowledge is what's different in their thinking compared to when they walked in the room. And where the gravity of the conversation kind of landed was, for the first time, we felt we had a real discussion, not a forced discussion. We had the conversation that mattered, not the conversation we wanted to hear. And we need to hear from everybody in this room, and where it's physically possible. I'm throwing away tables. I am literally putting people in a circle with chairs. And if I sense the group has got the energy and the mindset there, I'm happy and have done where I get them sitting cross-legged around a circle. Again, if you talk to any anthropologist, there's reasons why campfires work. It's a tradition and a ritual that's sustained us as humans for millennia. And as you go around the room, you can go around sequentially. I never do that. I always ask the person who speaks, so I'll ask the first person, just to make an invitation to the next person. Mm-hmm. Equally, I make the invitation that you may not have a reflection, and that's okay. Now, what I've noticed is people get really judgy about that when people don't, and I have to kind of bring the room back to go, they'll process it in their own time. It's rare, but it's unfortunate that people get judged by not doing that as well. So in having that ritual, people not only consolidate the meaning they've made from the day, but they've consolidated the meaning the room has made from the day and where they would take that. Typically, unfortunately, it usually doesn't happen. And people say to me, wow, that was probably the most potent part of what you did, because most of the time we're just rushing a to-do list and action owner status and who's going to do it after the workshop. If you create how to get it done, there's no need for accountability buddies or a list, because the group commits to itself. So for me, as important as the funeral is in the opening, it's the ritual of creating a story of group meaning. And there will be one phrase that the whole group will latch onto, and that will become the phrase they use for the year, like Elaine and the snake story as an example. So if you don't close out, people feel like, where's the chapter in this book? Mm-hmm. We didn't get to values in that conversation. We didn't have things on the wall, but we got to a really rich conversation about where we're not showing up as a group in values.
What's what I love about that is there's this because there's kind of like a knowingness in the lead up to it that if we there's several things opened up for me in hearing you say that. One is the kind of empathy and the kind of the clarity you have with the leader organizing this before going in, and have the conversations that almost prime them for, you know, we may end up in areas that are in uncharted territory, and we've got to have a certain fluidity with how we approach the agenda, and you know, there might be some ambiguous terrain and stuff that we end up in, and there's still a close. What I love is, and of course there's a close, but it may not be in concrete action, but it may be more contextual or conceptual. This kind of metaphorical rally point or a mantra or something that can be a placeholder for the richer complexity of the conversation that was had, and then that in itself is almost has a mimetic effect. It's like a new meme, a new shared idea between new intersubjective belief between the team, which what was what was interesting for me, because we seem to have this kind of bias towards, not a bias, but the examples we're using as a single day. There's something immensely powerful when it's a 2-day workshop, I find, because you can take them into the depth of the abyss and then do the ritual of breaking bread together and having that meal and reforging or retying the bonds, then having the amazing generative power of a good sleep and approaching it again with a fresh perspective the next day. Do you often do the 2-day?
It's probably a third of the facilitation work in the context of that. And it's so true, the observations you make about the power of a good night's sleep, the power of breaking bread together, whether that's breakfast or dinner or both. But it's also the power that distance and time takes us away from the moment to distill its essence. You know, I love both what dashi stands for, as Japanese chefs make this beautiful, nuanced and delicate broth with layers and layers of texture and flavor in them. And that's a function of time. And I think that function of time comes through these multi-day events. And it's not only the group conversation in the moment, in the room, but it's the reflection between 2 and 3 people, and inevitably the conversation leads to what happens in the room, where people are challenged by, oh, wow, that's the perspective you took out of that part of the agenda. I never would have thought about it like that. You've changed my view. And when I think about what is listening, it's the openness to have your mind changed. It's not about any technique. And if we can over dinner, where we slow down enough, we're distracted enough, whether that's the ritual of the courses or whether it's the wine or just the conversation, it distracts us enough to go, where's the dashi? Where's the essence of this conversation? And yet in sharing our recipe, our dashi recipe with somebody else who was present on the day, they go, wow, I never would have thought to use soy in that way. You've changed my mind. And that's why coming into day 2, a lot of people call this the philosopher's walk. The philosopher's walk is, how do you walk through the big elements of day 1? And that's why it's critical to capture analog, not digital artifacts at the event that were created by the participants. I don't care how bad they are at drawing, it's their expression. You know, some of the best conversations have happened where people have literally drawn very squiggly lines, but there's so much meaning in those squiggly lines because people heard the story that overlays that from day 1. What it also means for day 2 is, in some ways, progress is faster because there's a shared context already. But equally, there's an openness to, heck, the agenda was a guideline yesterday. Should we reset the agenda? Is often a question I pose at the beginning of day 2. What would be productive, not just for you guys in the room, and I use that generically. We serve our staff members who aren't in the room. We serve our stakeholders. We serve our customers. We serve our voters, whatever the systemic implication of this room is. And I invite the group to make a reflection. What would they ask of the agenda right now rather than what you would ask? And there's been some delightful transformations at that point because they said, you know, we kind of skated over that on day 1. We can go really deep here on day 2 because I can hear the voice of Mary, Jane and John, key employees that are challenging us, or key customers, or it could be a director general in a government department or even a minister. So one of the things I'm deliberately playing with in day 2, day 1 is kind of about them, their system. I almost incubate them in their own mindsets and their own approach. Day 2 is getting them external. So if you're really going to drive systemic change, it never comes from within the system. It's always imposed externally. So I take them way out. I take them way out in space, in time, in possibilities on day 2 to go, that was an interesting introspection yesterday. Now let's get way out of there and let's go to a completely different galaxy. And the tension, you can see them playing with the tension going, I've got my deliverable, but I really want to be in that conversation. And that's where the breakthroughs happen on day 2. And generally I find before lunch, the afternoon session is kind of summarizing and again, making meaning of it. But when we go and explore galaxies far, far away and possibilities that they may never considered, like what would this mean in 10 years' time? An agenda question I pose. What would this mean to your grandchildren? A question I pose. For all the customers who have left us, not the ones we love and know and spend lots of, but the ones that have left and gone to the competition, what are they expecting you to put on the agenda? These are the explorations we can do on the day.
Amazing.
Well, as the listening guy, I've done a lot of talking.
That's great. It's great. No, it's wonderful. It's fascinating. It's nice to kind of compare notes. There's a lot of similarities in our approach and also some distinctions and nuances. Certainly, I'm learning a heap. And I mean, there's also something quite artificial about the concept of a strategic offsite or a leadership thing, which we kind of honed in on. It's quite, it's hierarchical. It's kind of, but at the same time, in a large organization context, the space to actually process the more complex challenges doesn't happen day to day. It doesn't happen week to week, and it doesn't happen on a monthly call. So it's good to create this space. I wonder if we maybe just I'm just going to tilt into a different style of things.
Yeah, and Jason's leaning in like a DJ making a move right now.
I can't. Yeah, that's it's. So there's two quotes that really struck me when it comes to this listening thing that I'd love to hear your interpretation for you to play with them briefly. One comes from the School of Life, had a beautiful article that said one of the paradoxes of being a good listener is actually being a skilled interrupter. And the purpose of being a skilled interrupter means you can get to the deeper layers of things when you catch people kind of sharing a narrative that maybe is a bit cyclic and not going somewhere. I've always found that I've been in environments where there have been thinking spaces, Nancy Klein's thinking environment spaces, where there's a reverence around not interrupting, about how interruptions can sometimes be a form of violence in a way. Particularly being a white male, I'm conscious about the space that I take up in areas. How do you navigate the tension of knowing, or how do you... That sense of, all right, this is where I need to step in, interrupt. Like I just, and I know this is another nuanced thing, but I'd just be so curious to know how you might approach that paradox.
Yeah, it reminds me of a conversation Adam Grant had with Melinda Gates about, she called herself a great listener, but equally there's a time to stop listening. And back to that article, if I remember it well, it also said one of the metaphors to think about is that a skilled listener is not just an interrupter, but an editor, somebody who helps people to edit their thoughts, not just expand their thoughts. And yes, for most people, from a listening perspective, the challenge you face is the moment you want to interrupt. And I'm just looking at the interrupting listening figurines over there.
Oh, yes. Yes. I'm glad that they could be woven in. Yeah.
And interruption is just count 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, and then breathe. And for many of us, that's the consciousness we need to have, is that our interruption is about us and not about them. So the distinction is, when you're listening well, you're not listening for your own insight. When you're listening well, you're helping them listen to themselves.
Oh, wow. That's profound.
It's a huge difference. So Nell, my business manager, she came on about 18 months ago, and she's an amazing student. She's simultaneously a mum with 2 kids. She's studying at Monash online, doing a psychology degree, and she's working with me as well. And she said, and also parallels. I was doing some work in a Japanese organization, and the Japanese CEO said to me, Oscar, this book, it's so simple, it's so elegant, but
Beautiful.
it's so difficult to practice. And Nell said to me, hey, this deep listening is hard, it's tiring. And I said, Nell, it's actually easy. If you're listening for your understanding, you're missing the point. Listening is to help the speaker with their understanding and their meaning. And that makes it light and playful and about them. It's not about you. So back to the question, when is it right to interrupt? My easiest answer is going to frustrate you. It's about what you sense. It's about your intuition. It's your gut feel about when is the moment that the story does become cyclic, where the story becomes unproductive. But if you're present, if your phone's off, you don't have any devices around, you're just engaging with another human, that moment where interruption is helpful becomes self-evident. But for most of us, we're so distracted.
I probably would have been frustrated with any other answer. I love that. Okay, it's beautiful, and that's something I'm going to be reflecting on, and that's something that's quite a gift for anyone in any moment where they find themselves in a deep and meaningful with a friend, in a situation where we're talking with a colleague and it's going into some territory. It's a nice frame before jumping in to think, is this helping them to arrive at a deeper insight? This might relate a little bit. There's a quote from one of my all-time favorite books called The Listening Society by Hansi Freinacht. He says that listening is the highest form of jihad. And my interpretation of that probably I should have asked this question much earlier. We'll see if we can go with like a 5-minute version of this or less. Listening is the highest form of jihad in that by actually genuinely listening to other perspectives and other forms of view, there's something where the kind of the duality of it potentially dissolves. It becomes less about this versus that, and it's one of those things. It's one of those simple lines that there's some words I don't really like. I try to make sure that I never use the word shame or hate. I just don't like them in my vernacular, and jihad is probably one of those in that territory as well. But I'm just curious as to how you might relate to the notion of listening from a perspective of selfness, from the sense of the kind of the co-created interplay, the dance that we're all in. And there's also this sense of when people experience things like mindfulness has become a big buzzword now. People are drawing the distinction between attention versus mindfulness, and I'm glad for the nuance that's happening there. There is a general vibe when it comes to listening that it's a very passive activity. It's very benign, almost bovine-like. You're just simply passively listening, and that there's a charge that listening is the highest form of jihad. With all that mess of a kind of provocation there, what do you make of the? Well, I don't even know the question I'm asking you, but I'm curious of what do you make of this mess that I've just presented you.
I'm tempted to ask you a clarifying question. So rather than
that's a classic move, isn't it?
No. So rather than fall to the
Thank you.
temptation, I'm going to explore a little bit more. And apologies for the mixed metaphor. But I always say listening to what's unsaid is the ultimate ninja move. So too much of listening is passive because we're just listening to the content. And a slightly higher version of listening may be listening to the context. How does this fit into patterns or language or time and space orientation? But for me, if we remember this really simple thing, we think at on average 900 words a minute, but we can only speak at 125 to 150.
Yes.
Therefore, what comes out of my mouth the first time, there's an 11% chance what I'm saying is what I'm actually thinking. thus the importance of exploring the unsaid. And in exploring the unsaid, listening moves from a passive activity to an active activity, not for the person listening, but for the person speaking. And your role as the listener is to help the person speaking come to their meaning. And in doing so, you can also help them change their mind, which I think is the implication of the original question about listening as the ultimate form of jihad. Rarely have minds been changed without listening. And yet in a world that's perpetually in broadcast mode, both from a technology point of view, whether that's a media point of view, whether that's YouTube point of view, whatever that is, what we have achieved is a polarization and an integration where we're polarized with those that say what we say and think what we think. The duality of me thinking about the opposites consistently got me to a space 3 years ago where I started listening to the podcasts I had diametrically opposed views to.
Yes. Wow.
And it was prompted by me attending an academic conference. I'm not an academic. I was attending as a practitioner around listening, and it was called The Politics of Listening. And the conversation was taking place amongst people from South Africa, from the UK, from Canada, the US, Australia, Germany, and Singapore. And the conversation was about who we shouldn't be listening to. Now, the minute I hear absolutes like shouldn't, or, it automatically goes, I'm curious, what's that about? And basically the hypothesis that this group had come to was we should be shutting down anybody who has right-wing media views. Now, the spectrum of what right-wing was vast. Everything from, somebody who may have a view about abortion to somebody who might have a view about homeschooling or anything in that range in between. And it got me so curious. I said, because as a non-academic, you don't have permission to ask a question. It's only the academics that are participating in this dialogue. And I slipped a note to the facilitator asking permission for a reflection, not a question. And my reflection was simply this. And she read it out at the end and said, Oscar's asked us to reflect on the fact we're choosing not to listen to other people and the irony of that in the context of the event they were at. So that prompted me to go, I'm now going to start to listen to podcasts that are considered different to, or the right-wing ones that they were all referencing. And they were referencing some broadcast journalists in Australia, the UK, the US, and some I knew and some I didn't know, but I didn't know them or their work. I just knew of people's opinions of them. Now, don't get me wrong. Some of these people can come up with some ideas that you just go, wow, where does this come from? But I think we need to be open to the possibility that our mind can be changed. So if my belief is listening is about the possibility that your mind can be changed, then I need to listen to opposing views of mine. And the question I'd leave for everybody in the audience is, when was the last time you truly, deeply listened with your head, your heart, and your gut to somebody who had an opposing view to you, and listen to what could be true and what could be false in what you think about their ideas? And in some respects, it's changed my mind on this very premise. It's changed my mind to go, I now have evidence to say that listening is about being open to having your mind changed, because in what these broadcasters and podcasters are saying, I have become open to hearing and listening to what they're saying. Some have changed my mind on particular topics. Some of them haven't. It was the opportunity to engage in the contest of idea. Like, they don't know me, but I've heard what they have to say. And again, for all of us, and particularly in this prose around listening is the ultimate form of jihad, my invitation to everybody is subscribe to a newsletter you would vehemently disagree with. Listen to a podcast or a radio show or a TV show about somebody you'd vehemently disagree with, and listen to the whole episode or read the whole thing, because in that you'll start to listen to yourself. And I think that's the highest level of listening.
Beautiful. Wonderful. Well, I've got the thing going on where I'm conscious, and the irony is we do have a bit of an agenda here because you have a flight to catch. So partly I was trying to cram in all the cool bits before it wrapped up. This is beautiful, and perhaps you've now this. I wonder. I'll do a bit of an intro, but do you want to do like it's almost cinematic, where the title of the movie appears right at the very end? Do you want to do something like, "Hi, I'm
Hi, I'm Oscar Trimboli, and I'm on a quest to create 100 million deep listeners in the world."
Beautiful. I'm going to do an intro and outro with all the links to your wonderful stuff. It's kind of fun seeing your podcast and my podcast because we both kind of appear. I think we've got quite an overlap on each other's audiences. So I'm sure a lot of my folks are aware of your work. But Deep Listening with Oscar Trimboli, a beautiful podcast, and I'll share all the links. The final thing I might ask is a gift to our listeners, and I think you may have provided that in the last answer, but I like to, when I remember, to gift listeners with a question for them to ponder, or a question that they might take with them, or an activity that they might want to consider doing. Do any questions or activities or anything come to mind beyond the beautiful gift you just gave of listening to a podcast you might not otherwise be inclined to?
Yes, and this came about from a fascinating assignment I had with a leader in Australia who'd worked for the same company as a graduate all the way through the age of 45. So their worldview, they were lucky they were in a multinational, so their worldview wasn't as narrow as what it could be. And I said, how would you broaden your worldview? And they came back to me about 3 weeks later and said, I've subscribed to a newsletter from a different industry in a different language.
Oh, wow.
And what I've learnt from that is in using the Google Translate stuff so it was Hindi and it was science. So the newsletter was a scientific newsletter in Hindi. And they discovered some of their cognitive barriers, blocks, assumptions in unpicking something, not just from a different industry, but from a different language. Now, that was super brave. It's like, pick a different industry and then pick a different language. And that resulted in them getting a completely different perspective on something in Australia.
Wow.
Because they were brave enough to explore something really different. So subscribe to a newsletter in a different industry from yours, in a different language to yours.
Brilliant. This is wonderful. It's been such a joy. I look forward to our next conversation at some time in the future. Oscar Trimboli, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for listening.
And there we have it. And of course, what happened afterwards, as soon as I turned off the record button, Oscar and I sat here and we had further rich conversation. I was really worried that he had to go and I was keeping him from his plane. But he was gracious. There's kind of this kind of unhurried, calm demeanor that Oscar is able to maintain. So one of the things he asked for is how was it and stuff, like guess it's I guess the equivalent to the no, I shouldn't go there. So anyway, was it good for you? It was good for me. It was this kind of constructive thing where we're able to go into this introspective and constructive mode around the podcast conversation itself, which I found really lovely. I mean, as ever, you know, we could have gone on for another hour. There's kind of more, and my hope is that Oscar and I get a chance to chat again sometime in the next half year, because I think there's more nuance and more depth to tease out of this. One of the things he suggested to me, which I really loved and appreciated, was that he was told by a coach or something about dragging out more of the mistakes, more of the frailty, fragility, or what people are frightened of, really builds connection within a podcast. And I don't know that we really got to that opportunity. I'm still in the phase, as you heard, about the question about the interruption thing, where I don't like disrupting people's flow. I find that the world is largely very good at interrupting flow, and so I didn't quite get to those areas, but it was lovely feedback to get, and I think it just is testament to the to use what is being corrupted into a buzzword now, that the vulnerability of being on a podcast, the intimacy, the realness, where you can't really just get away with sharing your usual shtick, or maybe you can actually, but the skilled interviewer is able to kind of unearth the kind of the thinking, or the stuff that is unsaid, to use the things that are unsaid, to kind of paraphrase Oscar. So I found that to be quite marvelous. Yes, so this was a lovely conversation. Hopefully more of this, and I don't know what else I'm going to say, so I shall leave it at there. Thank you. I honestly, this is this funny. There's this funny thing with the podcast, because I really try to steer away from the metrics and optimization. I don't really want to start to gamify this in my mind. You start looking at metrics for a podcast, you start to see, how many subscribers have we got? Where's the drop off? At what point do people stop listening? And then you start to go and overly engineer and optimize how you conduct a show based upon metrics that it just starts to sneak in this artificiality or this contrivedness to things. So I don't really pay attention to any of that, but I do really appreciate it. A long while ago, I kind of planted this keyword blueberry in, and I said, anyone who's listened this far in, if you can just email me with the line blueberry, then I know you've kind of gotten this far. And many did. And I really, there's just something really lovely about that. So enough of me. Thank you for joining me once again, and look forward to some more for me sometime. I'm really hoping to shift this to a weekly thing, but sometime in the next 1 to 3 weeks, I shall get back to the many questions that I have yet to address, some of which are very many number of months old. So I shall get to that. Thank you, and see you again soon. Bye.